Hello and welcome to API Security with a Pinch of Salt. We're back for episode number 2, where we're going to talk about the importance of API documentation. And I'm joined again today by my two favorite SEs, Adam and Ron. And it occurred to me as we started doing this session that I didn't let these guys introduce themselves. So I'm going to let them do that as we kick this off. And we'll do that starting with Adam.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Chris. Adam Fisher. I've been in application security for 10 years. Before SALT and before APIs became the new attack vector, I was focused on web application firewalls, bot mitigation, credential stuffing, and protecting enterprises and their web apps from those styles of attacks.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. Ron, you want to give a bit on your background?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, similar. Ron Barth, similar background to Adam with web application firewalls, bot mitigation, and now API security.
Awesome. Well, we're happy to have you both on board. Let's see. So, as I mentioned at the start here, we're going to talk about the importance of API documentation. We might as well start asking a real simple question, and I'll ask this to you, Ron. Why is documentation so important? Why do people care? Why should they care about documentation of APIs?
Definitely. So API documentation is important for, I would say, two main reasons. The first reason to document your APIs is your API consumers. It could be internal or external. People who are going to use your APIs need to know how to use it, what kind of APIs are you offering, and really how to implement the use of those APIs. That's the first use case. The second use case is obviously for security reasons. Your security teams need to be aware of their attack surface, right? So if you're releasing APIs and opening up those APIs to the public or to external, or also internal sources, they need to be secured. And so your security personnel need to be aware of what's out there, and that's how they become aware, right? You document your APIs.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Adam, how is documentation done today? How are the various teams or companies that you're working with? How are they doing it today?
Exactly. So, there's an API standard documentation. Most companies and most businesses will refer to this as a Swagger file. And in there, you can add, varying granularity levels of detail around your API. You can get very specific, or it can be very high level. But that's not usually what happens. We don't have the discussion about how granular it is. It's really about if it exists or not. And we can judge a business's maturity practices really around whether or not they have such documentation. We recently had a conversation where, an enterprise, that was their bread and butter. They lived off of that. That was their standard. While another enterprise, similar scope and industry, they haven't even began to implement or to document their APIs in that fashion. So it's really spread across the board. And it's a practice that should be in place, but oftentimes, like we see with just documentation in general, it's an afterthought.
Well, yeah, it's not. I think there's probably very few people who are passionate about documentation, and especially API documentation. There's probably some of those folks out there, but few and far between.
Yep.
So Ron, what is the downside, of a company who doesn't get it, or for a company who doesn't get it right or doesn't do it right, who kind of falls short of documenting their API properly?
Yeah. So the downsides are, depending on your audience, whether it's your consumers of the audience of the documentation, obviously, right? So whether it's the consumers of the APIs or your security teams. So for the consumers of the APIs, the downside is very clear. If you don't document it well, it's going to be very hard for them to use it. If you have a new API that you're exposing, but nobody knows about it because it's undocumented, then it's not going to get used. If you have a misdocumented API, people are going to fail using it or use it incorrectly. So that's the downside for your consumers. For the security teams, The downside is that they will not know what they need to protect and how to protect it. They will not know to prioritize which APIs are more important than others. If the documentation is incomplete or wrong, that's what's going to happen. So if you have an old API that is only used by the older version of your mobile app, and that API is not documented, then nobody will know that they need to protect it. If you have an API that exposes a lot of PII, but the documentation does not highlight that, then your security team will not know that they need to prioritize that API and make sure that it's protected.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that represents a huge security gap. So Adam, you touched on this a little bit before, talking about customers on either end of the spectrum, those that are very mature and they have some documentation, and those that have nothing at all, they're just getting started. What in your experience, where do you think most customers are, or where do they think they are when you start engaging with them?
Definitely, most customers have no concept of API documentation. That's the majority of businesses today. A lot are playing catch up. A lot are maybe just now creating it for a few critical APIs. But on the flip side, those that do are truly reliant upon that documentation. It often leads to a false sense of compliance or security, if you will, where they think because they have it documented that it's been written in stone tablets and it's never going to change. That's what they base everything off of. And we've seen in many cases where that's not the case. They might provide us the documentation that they have, and they're very confident it's correct. It doesn't take long to identify the gaps in that documentation. Like Ron said, now they've released new versions. They're not documented. And so even because they have it, doesn't mean that they're safe.
So Ron, I think Adam touched on some of the challenges. One of the challenges obviously stems from the fact that applications and APIs are kind of a moving target, right? They're constantly evolving. What are some of the other challenges you're seeing? Is what's keeping people from doing what they need to do, even though they need to do it, right? There are benefits on both sides.
Documentation is not something that people like to do. And when someone doesn't like to do it, they neglect doing it, they forget to do it. And when they do it, sometimes it's not perfect. The problem is, you release a new API or you update an existing API, and especially if it's something that's being done, on a tight time schedule. People neglect documenting all the time because they don't have time, and for various other reasons. And then those reasons is what's causing the different gaps and challenges that we briefly covered, right? So security personnel who are not aware of APIs, APIs that are completely undocumented, and your consumers cannot use them, and so on.
Makes sense. So it seems like anytime you put a human in place or depend on humans to do things, especially when it comes to security, there's oftentimes risk of a gap, right, or things falling out of phase. Which is what we see here with documentation, and it has implications on both sides of the fence, both on the development and the security side. We here at Salt think it's a super important part of security, and have built this into our product. We call it Discovery. Adam, do you want to talk a little bit about what Salt Security Discovery does and why it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. And really what we do here at Salt is we take that manual documentation process and turn it into an automatic one, right? We take the onus of the development team informing security of what APIs are in your environment and how they're used, and automate that process so that the security team has clear visibility now into what APIs are accessing what data, and in essence, discovering or building that documentation for you automatically. And so that's a huge value gain for an enterprise, especially for those businesses now that are looking to get that definition, get that documentation in place, and then for the ones that have already created that documentation to either, one, validate that it's still accurate and that what they have is correct, but then also to see what maybe is lacking, what endpoints are not documented, and again going back to like the shadow IP where you have different versions of IPs to see which ones maybe should have been decommissioned, um, because now they're old, but they're still available. So there's lots of use cases around, discovering automatic discovery of APIs in your environment.
So Ron, I know you talk to a lot of customers, and discovery is one of the first things that they experience from using Salt Security, using our solution. What are some of the things that you see or that they see running discovery? What are some of the aha moments for them?
Yeah, definitely. So the Salt Security is going to give you full visibility into all of your APIs and extend your existing documentation, even if you have documentation already. And that what that entails, or what that covers, is visibility into what we call shadow APIs, which are APIs that either very old APIs you forgot exist, or an API you spun up for a bug bounty or something like that, and nobody documented. It will give you visibility into your existing API in a very granular manner that is more granular than your documentation. As an example, if you have an email field and you documented that field, and that field is documented as a string, the Salt Security discovery will highlight that field as an email type, not just a string type, but specifically email type. So you'll know exactly the type of field that you're getting. And then on top of that, you're getting PII documentation from Salt. So Salt will let you know for each API endpoint, does it expose PII, and which fields are carrying PII information.
So there's obviously a security benefit there, understanding your attack surface and understanding the structure of your APIs. There's some benefit to the developers, but it also sounds like there could be some benefit to a compliance team or any group that has to adhere to some kind of compliance standards or requirements, because you understand where your PII is, right?
Yeah, precisely. So the security teams are going to enjoy that discovery very much. Just by understanding what they have out there and which APIs are more important than others. Your development team would be able to have full understanding of all of the APIs, and also a better understanding on how to secure those APIs. And then obviously on the compliance side, once you get that mapping of PII, it helps you become more compliant.
One of the things I want to make clear, I'm not sure if it was clear, is that this is an ongoing process, right? With our discovery capability. The way we do what we do is by ingesting API traffic, we're able to keep this documentation and subsequently a catalog. If you think of it as a catalog of APIs, we're able to keep that up to date, right? So, Adam, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like we've been saying, when we're dealing with documentation, that's a snapshot in time. And if you think of the time it took to get just to that snapshot, to go through the process again, maybe to update that file and to update your API documentation is just as much work, if not more, to get back to a current state in that API Swagger file. And so to have a process that is continuous, it's not something that is scheduled. We don't need permissions across different subnets to do some type of a network scan. We're looking at real live traffic, and so we can discover automatically when your APIs change. And we continue to keep that documentation updated for you. That's a big win, and it takes a lot of effort, a lot of work off of the various teams that will be in charge of creating your API documentation for you. So having that current and having that automatically maintained, like Ron said, is a big win. It's a big value gain. It's a great wow moment for our customers when they deploy the solution.
Anything that makes security and development happy is a good thing.
Exactly.
Well, guys, I want to thank you both for spending the time to go through a little bit more detail around API documentation, the challenges, and the importance of why we need to make sure we have documentation, especially from a security standpoint. And thanks for the insights on how SALT does it. With that, I want to thank you both again for your time and look forward to having you on again to talk more about API security in the future.